Hey guys, I have another ghost story for you from the book Haunted Wisconsin. This one is called The Cantankerous Ghost of St. Croix County. August 30th, 1873 was a fine day for cutting hay, and St. Croix County farmer Richard Lynch welcomed assistance from his neighbor Frank Duffy. Side by side they worked, swinging their scythes in the sun-washed field at the hem of the forest. At 4 o'clock, Miss Lynch screamed from the house. The men ran, reaching the log home in time to see chairs jumping to the ceiling and crashing to the floor, tinware and cooking utensils flying across the room and landing in a far corner. Beyond the open doorway, slabs of boards and scraps of iron sailed through the air. The three rushed outside. Duffy, determined to catch the culprit, stationed himself at the one corner of the house, with Lynch at the diagonal corner, so that together they had a full view of all sides of the house. Duffy saw no one. Suddenly, a large pine box near Duffy leaped into the air and landed 10 feet away on the porch. A moment later, an old horseshoe that had been hanging on a peg in the milk house arced through the air and came to rest beside the box. Instantly, a commotion rocked the empty house. The Lynches and their neighbor ran back inside. Everything movable had been piled high into one corner. Later, a braddock that had been stuck into the edge of a log by the milk house struck the side of the dwelling's doorway and bounded several feet into the room. Mrs. Lynch seized the axe, took it to the milk house, and jammed it onto a box. She covered the box with slats and a bag of salt. No sooner had she returned to the house than the axe reappeared, this time settling on the porch. Her husband grabbed the axe, took it a short distance from the house, and pushed it into a hollow log. There it remained, at least for the rest of the day. If Duffy was shaken by these manifestations, the Lynches were less so. Although this August afternoon was the first time that these Caddy Township residents had actually seen objects flying from place to place, they'd been plagued by perplexing incidents since December of 1871. In the latter part of the month, Miss Lynch began missing dresses. Some were found rolled and stuffed into odd nooks and crannies. Others have been cut to shreds, suitable only for the rag bag. 2 holes were cut in a feather bed. Dishes and pans disappeared, to be located later in an unusual place. Sometimes Mrs. Lynch, while preparing a meal, would put down a utensil, look away for a moment, then find that the tool had vanished. Immediate suspicion centered upon the 4 children: David, 17, Mary, 10, Georgie, 7, and Rena, 2. All denied knowledge of the mischief, but Georgie, who had been caught in a number of childish pranks, was often spanked when anything went missing. One day Lynch returned home from town with dress goods for his wife. She put the material away in the bedroom. Several days later, when she went for it, it was gone. It was located finally in the barn, rolled into a bundle with the shears inside. From the cloth had been cut the skirt and sleeves of a dress to fit Mary. A second bolt of material vanished also. Weeks later, it was found rolled into a hanging wall mat. A perfect bib-type apron had been cut from the cloth. The parents were stunned. They didn't think Georgie was responsible, but without proof, they couldn't be certain. Although only a few neighbors had known of these early bizarre incidents, news of the flying furniture and farm implements spread like a prairie fire. Area newsmen visited the Lynches to witness the poltergeist activities, then vied with one another in recounting what one editor called the most absurd capering of some supernatural agency. Strangers, their imaginations sparked by what they read, converged upon the little homestead in the clearing. By foot, by horse, by rumbling ox-drawn wagon they came, winding their way through the nearly impenetrable forest known as the Big Woods. One newsman estimated that more than 300 visitors had decided upon the Lynch family within a 6 weeks period. Another estimated 1,000 visitors. Meanwhile, the uneasy mother had begun binding Georgie's hand and foot and tying him onto a chair or a cradle. One day while she was washing clothes, Georgie was tied into his cradle, with Mary watching him. Mrs. Lynch turned from the washboard to put some wood into the stove. Turning back to the washtub, she found her bowl of soft soap gone. She went after more, and, upon her return, Georgie told her the soap was under his head. The startled mother raised the child's head from the crib pillow and found the soap. Neither Georgie nor Mary could explain how it got there. But it didn't seem to matter whether Georgie was found. Often while the child was confined, a teacup would fly to the floor and smash, or a saucer would leap from the sideboard and land undamaged on the floor. Then Georgie would shout out, "There, Mother, you see, I didn't do that." One incident greatly distressed Mrs. Lynch. Little Rena, the baby, had very beautiful hair. It hung in long golden ringlets, of which her mother was naturally very proud of. On a warm April day, the little girl was playing on the porch in front of the house. The mother, finishing her work, went to check on her daughter. She gasped in horror. The child sat motionless on the porch, and her hair was sheared as close to the scalp as it could be cut. The shears were found a few feet away, but not a single lock of hair was ever found. On another day, Mrs. Lynch was cooking a kettle of squirrels for the family's midday meal. After cautioning Mary to wash the boiling pot, she took a pan to the milk house to get flour to make bread. She got the flour, sprinkled salt over it, then returned to the house. As she stepped into the doorway, she saw that the pot had disappeared from the stove. Mary claimed to know nothing of the pot's disappearance. Mrs. Lynch put the pan of flour on the table. Then she, Mary, Georgie began searching for the missing kettle. Emerging from the bedroom, Mrs. Lynch saw that the pan of flour was gone. In a few moments it was discovered under the stairway. Again it was placed on the table. Mother and children went up to the garret, and there, sitting in the middle of the bed, was the pot of squirrels. A corner of the bedspread had been thrown over the kettle. As Mrs. Lynch threw off the spread, the contents of the pot steamed and bubbled as if it were being lifted off the stove. The soot-blackened pot left no mark on the white sheet. Returning to the kitchen, Mrs. Lynch found the pan of flour again missing. It was discovered later behind the milk house. On another day, Mrs. Lynch went to the milk house for milk. She found each of the 5 pans of milk layered with soft soap. Stepping over to the soap barrel that stood in the corner, she noticed 4 or 5 impressions in the thick, pasty mass. Each bore the marks of a large adult hand. A hand with 3 fingers, mind you. Who did it? That was Dunn County News publishers R.J. Flynn and E.M. Weber wondered when they saw it. They wondered about a lot more, too, during their overnight visit to the mysterious house. Rock Flint reported that Messrs. Thompson, Kendall Johnson, Birch, and clerks in the Knapp, Stout and Company store arrived later that night from Meadowmoney. Sunday morning after breakfast, Flint and some of the other men went outside in order to give the family a chance to finish up their work. The morning air was chilly, and the visitors built a fire at the edge of the woods about 40 feet from the house. Suddenly they heard a noise coming from inside the house, a thumping noise as if a heavy weight had been fallen on the floor. Then another. Someone shouted that teacups were falling to the floor, striking the floor bottoms up, but not breaking. Flint wrote, Mrs. Thompson, who was near the door, stepped forward and picked up the cup, placed it on the table, took Georgie, who was in the room, by the hand and started for the door. In a moment, another cup sped to the floor and lay on its side, whirling with great rapidity. Thompson started for this one also, and as he grabbed it, the cup moved away from him and passed under the table. He went around to the other side and caught it while it was whirling. What transpired while we were at that fire, and we relate it substantially as it was told to us by several witnesses. Planting ourselves in the doorway, we stood prepared to see something. We had not long to wait. With almost lightning swiftness, an egg darted across the room, struck the corner of a box, and was smashed. Shortly after, the potato masher, which stood on the dresser, went the same way, with incredible speed, and landed in the corner kerslap. In a little while, a couple of pieces of broken crockery lying on the stove made a sudden change of pace and landed in the corner. These 3 things we saw distinctly, and others in the room saw them. Perhaps we were fooled by some trick of legerdemain. If so, who did it? The boy 7 years old who sat at the table quietly eating his breakfast? The girl 10 years old who stood nearby wiping a dish? Mrs. Lynch, who was busy at work? Or Mr. Lynch, who was not even in the house? It seems to us improbable, if not impossible. Yet the impossible events increased daily. Shortly after the newsman's visit, the Lynches hosted A.B. Finley, school superintendent of Barron County. He too stayed all night, and that night, for the first time, disturbances occurred in the house after the family had retired. All slept in the same bedroom, Mr. Lynch and his wife and Rena in one bed, Finley in a bed across the room, and Mary and Georgie sleeping in a bed on the floor between the other beds. Soon after they had retired, Georgie complained of something pinching and scratching him. Finley took Georgie into his own bed, but still the child complained. The guest then clamped the boy's hands in one of his own and put his other arm so tightly around him that Georgie could not move a muscle without detection. All was still. Suddenly Finley felt the bedclothes stirring. He swatted, he grabbed, and caught absolutely nothing. The stirrings continued far into the night, leaving the superintendent by dawn thoroughly exhausted and thoroughly baffled. Not so baffled was a reporter from the St. Paul Dispatch who visited the Lynches on November 3rd and the 4th, 1873. When curious scratching noises emitted from the children's bed during his all-night visit, he got up, pulled on his pants, and held the hands of both children. The noises stopped immediately. The reporter, after spending 20 hours in the house, went away convinced that Mrs. Lynch's 10-year-old Mary, whom he called strange and precocious, had duped people. He felt that Mrs. Lynch was bored and unhappy in her dreary backwoods home, that, after her husband's refusal to sell the farm and move back east, she created her own excitement. Also, because the remote location of the Lynch home meant that most visitors had to spend the night, the newsman felt that many guests paid much more for the hospitality than they would have paid in a commercial hostelry. The reporter saw the setup as a money-making scheme that Mrs. Lynch didn't want to replenish. The majority of the observers, however, continued to believe that the Lynches would have replenished almost anything to be rid of the manifestations, that they were victims rather than perpetrators of a havoc wrought. When Mr. Knight and Mr. Cohen, two gentlemen who lived near the Wilson Railroad Station, visited the house, the spirits were especially lively. While articles flew around the room, Knight took a sheet of paper and wrote down each occurrence as it happened. In the few hours the two men were there, Knight recorded more than 40 different manifestations. One time the potato masher flew from the cupboard and hit the floor on the opposite side of the room. Knight picked it up, replaced it on the cupboard, and remarked that he'd like to see them do that again. No family member was near the cupboard. Knight had scarcely seated himself when the masher zipped through the air and splintered to a mirror. About that time, Mrs. Lynch had finished grinding coffee in a portable still. She replaced the mill on a shelf and crossed the room to get something. As she walked away, the drawer of the coffee mill, partly filled with ground coffee, came out of the mill and followed, airborne, 2 feet behind her. One of the men sprang forward to catch the drawer, but it fell to the floor upside down. Until she heard it strike the floor, Mrs. Lynch had no knowledge of the drawer's movement. On another morning, Ambrose Evans visited the Lynches. When breakfast was ready, he sat down at the table. Every member of the family was present. Soon, the distinctive odor of kerosene filled the air. It seemed to be coming from the bedroom, whose door was open. Evans followed Mrs. Lynch into the room. There, in the middle of the bed, lay a jug of oil, uncorked. Nearly a gallon of oil had emptied upon the bed, saturating the feather bed and the quilts. When Milwaukee News correspondent J.D. Goodrich arrived at the house, the oldest boy and his father were working in a field, and the younger children were outside playing. Goodrich was standing by the outdoor cellar, talking to Mrs. Lynch, when a noise erupted from inside the house. "There," said Mrs. Lynch, "you hear that? And you also see that none of the family is in my house." Hurrying inside, Goodrich and his hostess found the table tipped over. By 8:30 the next morning, themes got livelier. Goodrich wrote, "One thing peculiar is that you never see a thing start, but the minute you turn your eyes, the things get up and it gets. Another peculiar feature is that where a thing strikes, there it lays, neither rolls nor bounds. We took some of the same things and threw them a number of times, but they would bound or roll every time. We saw a piece of broken cup hit a little 2-year-old girl on the back so hard, she nearly cried. A raw potato hopped out of a dish near where we were and lit on the floor. And while we were watching, a stove handle light in one place, a tin plate whisked by our head in another direction." The Reverend John Barker, who lived on Caddy Creek in Pierce County, was convinced that the devil was at work in the Lynch household. Bent upon exorcising the demon, he approached the neighbor's house with Bible and prayer book. Tying the 2 books into a handkerchief, he placed them on the stairway, then challenged the spirit to remove them. But something caused the minister to divert his eyes. When he looked again, the books were gone. After a lengthy search, they were found on a bed. Every leaf had been shaken out of the Bible, and the handkerchief was found in a barrel of feathers. As Barker gazed in astonishment, a box came whirling through the doorway and struck at his feet. Positive that someone had thrown it, he vowed to catch the prankster. After the axe had been placed in a trunk, Barker and the family members rushed outside. They saw no one. Upon their return, they found the axe standing by the door, resting on the blade. The dumbfounded old gentleman stepped cautiously around the room, never taking his eyes from the axe. Suddenly, it started toward him, rolling over and over. The white-faced minister asked his host if he might offer a prayer. No sooner was the amen spoken than pictures, maps, and clocks flew from the walls. Barker fled. It was about this time that the family Bible disappeared. After a lengthy search, it was found in a kettle of water above the stove, sandwiched between an apron and a tea canister. Meanwhile, as visitors filled the house, one braggart announced that he had $200 in his wallet that the spirit could have if it could take it. Within 5 minutes, the money was gone forever. If the casual observer could offer no explanation for the manifestations he witnessed, neither could the spiritualists and mediums who besieged the Lynch home after Lynch offered $50 to any psychic who could duplicate the poltergeist activities. None could, nor could they explain the mystery. One Saturday afternoon, a clairvoyant named Mellon from Rock Elm in Pierce County visited the Lynches. He saw nothing that day of otherworldly nature. The next day, he had better luck. He told Lynch that he saw the spirit of Lynch's first wife, that she had 6 other spirits were the cause of all the disturbances. When Lynch asked why so many things had been destroyed, Mellon said that it was to open the minds of the Lynch family and the minds of others in the community to the truths of spiritualism. Lynch grumbled that it seemed a questionable and expensive way to gain converts to the faith. A large group had gathered, and someone asked Mellon if the spirits could throw things around as they had done previously. The answer was yes. Lynch then asked them to move a cup from its shelf to the floor. The cup did not move. The spirit, speaking through Mellon, said that it was alone and could not perform without the assistance of the other spirits. Where were the other spirits? They had gone to Knapp Station, some 12 miles away, to attend a camp meeting. The spirit could not tell when they would return and finally agreed to go after them. The medium then announced that the spirit had departed and that there was no telling when it would come back. Visitors muttered humbug and shuffled away. Some time later, Mrs. Carleton, a clairvoyant from River Falls, visited Lynch's. She, too, saw 7 spirits. She advised the family to keep all visitors away and to hold seances among themselves, during which the mystery would be explained through the mediumship of someone in the family. Lynch, although skeptical, gave it a try. During several family circles, the table moved about, but all seemed at questioning proved abortive, and the family gave up spiritualism in disgust. In the later part of October, the manifestations became more violent and more destructive than at any previous period. One day, while Mrs. Lynch and Mary were alone in the house, the table started across the room, banded to the ceiling and back to the floor, then hit the side of the room hard enough to split one of the leaves. In a violent-defiant gesture, it leaped into the air and crashed to the floor with such force that the entire top was wrenched from the frame. Surveying the property, losses smashed furniture, broken dishes, mangled silverware, shattered mirrors and clocks, shredded clothing, Lynch regretted ever bringing his family into Marshall County, Indiana 2 years ago. Exhausted by the discomfort and inconvenience of sharing his small house day and night with curious strangers, and desperate to put an end to the activities of the unseen ghost, he made a bold decision, announcing that he was splitting up the family. He promptly bundled Mary and Georgie off to the McMahons, neighbors living a mile away. With the children's departure, peace settled upon the Lynch's household. From that day on, no unusual occurrences were reported at either house. Are there rational explanations for this story? Possibly. If, as one reporter thought, Mrs. Lynch was retaliating against her husband for his refusal to sell the farm, couldn't she have enlisted Mary's help in performing some of the mysterious feats? Together or singly, the woman could have cut the dress material or punched holes in the feather bed. Couldn't Mrs. Lynch have encouraged the children to hide pots and pans and kitchen utensils? Did Mary grab the bowl of soap while her mother's back was turned, then put it under Georgie's head when Mrs. Lynch left the room to get more soap? Did she also put the kettle of squirrels on the bed in the garret, stir up the bedclothes to keep Georgie and Finley awake all night, or cut her little sister's hair? Yet, if we attribute these activities to human intervention, that of the other manifestations to objects that flew around almost daily for a period of 2 months, the fact that all the services ceased after the children were removed to the neighbor's house doesn't prove that they had anything to do with it, at least not on a conscious level. Parapsychologists say that the mysterious movements of objects are often associated with the presence of young children, and more frequently by the presence of teenagers. It is thought that the turbulence and energy force of the teenager are somehow transferred to inanimate objects. The one teenager in the family, David, was mentioned only once in the news accounts, when Goodrich reported that the older boy was working in the field with his father. If in fact David had hired out to work for neighboring farmers, as was the custom for boys of his age at that time, could his psyche have remained behind to create the havoc? Or was Georgie the focus for the levitations, as some experts believe? Questions without answers. Today, the log house and the big woods in Caddy Township are gone. Silos dwarf white clapboard farmhouses near the once thriving village of Hatchville and fields unroll to the horizon. The remarkable story of the Lynch family stays alive only in the musty files of newspapers.